Theodore Roosevelt remains one of the most influential and dynamic figures in American history. His impact on the United States extended beyond his tenure as the 26th president, shaping the nation's policies, conservation efforts, and global presence. As a leader, he exemplified energy, determination, and a vision for progress that resonated with generations to come. His ability to blend political reform with a strong sense of national identity set a precedent for future leaders, making his legacy an enduring subject of historical analysis. Born into privilege, Roosevelt's life was far from easy. His early struggles with asthma and frailty could have defined his trajectory, but instead, they fueled his resilience and commitment to self-improvement. His philosophy of the strenuous life became a defining characteristic of his personal and political endeavors. This relentless drive helped him overcome obstacles and inspired others to embrace challenges rather than retreat from them. His belief that hard work and determination could shape character was a principle he carried into his presidency and beyond. Roosevelt's impact on domestic policy was profound. He championed the progressive-era reforms that sought to regulate big business, improve labor conditions, and protect consumers. His square deal policies emphasized fairness and sought to balance the interests of capital and labor. He believed that government had a moral responsibility to ensure justice in society, a principle that guided his approach to economic and social issues. Under his leadership, the federal government took an active role in breaking up monopolies, enforcing regulations, and establishing safeguards for the working class. In addition to his domestic achievements, Roosevelt reshaped America's foreign policy. His big stick diplomacy approach emphasized the necessity of military strength to maintain peace and assert influence on the global stage. His role in negotiating the end of the Russo-Japanese War earned him the Nobel Peace Prize, a recognition of his ability to navigate complex international affairs. He also spearheaded the construction of the Panama Canal, a monumental project that solidified America's position as a global power and revolutionized maritime trade. Conservation was another cornerstone of Roosevelt's legacy. Recognizing the rapid industrialization and exploitation of natural resources, he took significant steps to preserve America's landscapes. He established national parks, wildlife refuges, and forest reserves, ensuring that future generations would have access to the nation's natural beauty. His commitment to conservation was not merely an environmental effort, but a broader vision for responsible stewardship of the nation's resources. This initiative laid the foundation for modern environmental policies and remains one of his most celebrated contributions. Beyond policy, Roosevelt's personal charisma and leadership style left an indelible mark on the presidency. He was the first modern president to use the media effectively, understanding its power in shaping public opinion. His ability to connect with the American people through speeches, photographs, and direct engagement made him a relatable and inspiring figure. He transformed the presidency into an active, central force in American politics, setting a standard for future leaders to engage directly with the public. Roosevelt's influence extended into political ideology, where he reshaped the Republican Party and later founded the Progressive Party. His willingness to challenge the status quo and push for reforms, even at the cost of political alliances, demonstrated his commitment to principles over party loyalty. This independent streak, while at times controversial, solidified his reputation as a leader driven by conviction rather than political expediency. His legacy also lives on through his writings and personal reflections. A prolific author, Roosevelt documented his experiences, political philosophies, and historical perspectives in numerous books and essays. His literary contributions provide valuable insights into his worldview and the principles that guided his leadership. His reflections on war, nature, and governance continue to be studied by historians and political scholars. Even after leaving office, Roosevelt's presence in American politics remained significant. His return to the political arena in the 1912 election as a third-party candidate showcased his enduring influence and willingness to fight for progressive ideals. Though unsuccessful, His campaign reshaped the political landscape and introduced ideas that would later be implemented by future administrations. His lasting impact on political discourse and reform is evident in policies that continued to evolve long after his passing. Theodore Roosevelt was born on October 27, 1858, in a grand brownstone mansion in New York City. His family belonged to the upper class, enjoying the wealth and prestige that came from generations of successful businessmen and philanthropists. His father, Theodore Roosevelt Sr., was a respected merchant and one of the founders of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, while his mother, Martha Mitty Bullock Roosevelt, hailed from a Southern aristocratic family. The contrast between his father's disciplined Northern industriousness and his mother's warm Southern charm created an environment that shaped young Theodore's character. Despite being born into privilege, Roosevelt's early years were marked by considerable hardship. He suffered from severe asthma, which frequently left him gasping for breath in the middle of the night. His attacks were so intense that his parents often took him on carriage rides through the streets of New York, hoping the fresh air would provide some relief. At times, his condition was so grave that his family feared he might not survive childhood. His physical weakness, however, did not dampen his spirited nature. Instead, it fueled a determination to overcome his frailties and prove himself strong. Recognizing their son's limitations, Roosevelt's parents sought to provide him with both comfort and encouragement. His father, whom he deeply admired, advised him to build his body as well as his mind. This advice became a turning point in young Theodore's life. At the age of 12, he resolved to strengthen himself through rigorous exercise. With his father's help, he installed a gym in their home and dedicated himself to a regimen of weightlifting, boxing, and outdoor activities. This discipline not only improved his health, but also instilled in him a lifelong belief in the virtues of perseverance and self-improvement. Apart from physical challenges, Roosevelt displayed an insatiable intellectual curiosity from a young age. He was particularly fascinated by the natural world, spending hours studying birds, insects, and animals. His childhood notebooks were filled with meticulous drawings and observations of wildlife, foreshadowing his later passion for conservation. He even attempted to create a small natural history museum in his home, carefully preserving specimens he had collected. This deep appreciation for nature remained a defining aspect of his identity throughout his life. Education played a central role in Roosevelt's upbringing. He was initially homeschooled by private tutors, receiving a rigorous education in classical literature, history, and foreign languages. His father emphasized moral character as much as intellectual achievement, encouraging him to embrace responsibility and integrity. Though naturally intelligent, Roosevelt was not satisfied with merely absorbing information. He had a deep desire to apply his knowledge in meaningful ways. His studies fueled his sense of adventure and ambition, motivating him to pursue a life of action rather than passivity. At the age of 18, Roosevelt enrolled at Harvard University, one of the most prestigious institutions in the country. His time at Harvard was both challenging and transformative. Though he still struggled with occasional health issues, he refused to let them define him. He threw himself into academic life, excelling in subjects such as biology, history, and political science. His passion for natural history continued to thrive, and he considered a career as a scientist before ultimately shifting his focus to public service. Despite his academic achievements, Roosevelt did not conform to the typical mold of a Harvard student. Unlike many of his peers, who embraced a more leisurely college lifestyle, he maintained a rigorous daily schedule filled with intense study, exercise, and extracurricular activities. He joined several clubs, including the prestigious Purcellian Club, and became a prominent figure on campus. However, his energetic personality and outspoken nature sometimes made him a polarizing figure among his classmates. While at Harvard, Roosevelt experienced one of the most profound losses of his life. In 1878, his beloved father passed away suddenly from stomach cancer. This devastating event shook him to his core, as his father had been his greatest source of inspiration and guidance. Struggling with grief, Roosevelt found solace in his studies and personal pursuits, channeling his sorrow into a renewed sense of purpose. He resolved to live up to his father's ideals by dedicating himself to meaningful work and public service. Upon graduating from Harvard in 1880, Roosevelt faced an important decision about his future. He briefly considered attending law school at Columbia University, but found the study of law unfulfilling. Instead, he chose to immerse himself in the world of politics, a field where he believed he could make a real impact. His fascination with history, government, and leadership led him to run for public office at an unusually young age. This decision marked the beginning of a political career that would ultimately shape the future of the United States. As Theodore Roosevelt stepped into the world of politics, he did so with the same boundless energy and determination that had defined his youth. In 1881, at the age of 23, he won his first election, becoming a member of the New York State Assembly. Despite his privileged background, Roosevelt was not content with simply being a passive participant in government. Instead, he entered the political arena as a reformer, eager to challenge corruption and inefficiency. His relentless pursuit of justice and accountability quickly made him stand out, earning him both admirers and enemies among the political elite. Roosevelt's early years in the Assembly were marked by his fierce opposition to political corruption. At the time, New York politics was heavily influenced by party machines, particularly Tammany Hall, a powerful Democratic organization known for its patronage system and backroom deals. Roosevelt, a Republican, took a firm stand against these corrupt practices, pushing for laws that would bring greater transparency and fairness to government operations. His outspoken nature and refusal to be intimidated made him a controversial figure, but they also won him the respect of reform-minded colleagues and the general public. One of Roosevelt's most notable achievements during his time in the Assembly was his campaign against corporate monopolies and railroad interests. He fought tirelessly for legislation that would regulate these industries and prevent them from exploiting consumers. Though his efforts faced significant resistance from powerful business leaders, Roosevelt refused to back down. His willingness to take on major financial interests demonstrated his belief that government should serve the people rather than private corporations, a principle that would define much of his later political career. Beyond policy, Roosevelt's presence in the Assembly was impossible to ignore. He was known for his passionate speeches, delivered with an intensity that captivated both supporters and opponents. He had a habit of pacing the floor of the Assembly chamber, gesturing emphatically as he spoke, his voice ringing with conviction. His natural charisma and ability to command attention made him one of the most influential young politicians in the state. Even those who disagreed with him politically could not deny his remarkable energy and commitment to his ideals. Despite his rising political career, Roosevelt's personal life was struck by unimaginable tragedy. On February 14, 1884, he suffered the devastating loss of both his mother and his wife on the same day. His mother, Mittie, passed away from typhoid fever, while his young wife, Alice, whom he had married just a few years earlier, died from kidney failure shortly after giving birth to their daughter. The dual tragedy left Roosevelt emotionally shattered. In his personal journal that night, he wrote a single, haunting sentence: "The light has gone out of my life." Grief-stricken, Roosevelt made the drastic decision to leave politics and retreat to the Dakota Territory. In the vast and untamed wilderness of the American West, he sought solace in the physical challenges of frontier life. He purchased a cattle ranch and immersed himself in the rugged existence of a cowboy, herding cattle, hunting bison, and enduring the harsh conditions of the plains. This period of self-imposed exile allowed him to heal, both physically and emotionally, while also deepening his love for the natural world. It was in the Dakota Badlands that Roosevelt truly embraced the ideals of the strenuous life, testing his endurance and strengthening his resolve. While in the West, Roosevelt also developed a deeper understanding of the struggles faced by ordinary Americans. He witnessed firsthand the hardships endured by farmers, ranchers, and small business owners, many of whom were at the mercy of powerful corporations and corrupt officials. His experiences reinforced his belief in the need for government intervention to protect the interests of everyday citizens. The lessons he learned during this time would later inform his progressive policies as president. After 2 years in the Dakota Territory, Roosevelt returned to New York, re-energized and ready to re-enter public life. He resumed his political career with a newfound sense of purpose, determined to continue his fight for reform. In 1886, he ran for mayor of New York City, presenting himself as the candidate of honesty and efficiency. Though he ultimately lost the election, the campaign raised his national profile and demonstrated his ability to connect with voters from diverse backgrounds. It was clear that Roosevelt was not finished with politics. He was only just beginning. In the years that followed, Roosevelt took on various roles that further shaped his reputation as a reformer. He served on the United States Civil Service Commission under President Benjamin Harrison, where he worked to eliminate the spoils system and implement merit-based hiring in government jobs. Later, as New York City Police Commissioner, he waged war against police corruption, personally patrolling the streets at night to ensure officers were performing their duties honestly. These experiences reinforced his commitment to good governance and strengthened his credentials as a leader unafraid to challenge entrenched systems. By the late 1890s, Theodore Roosevelt had already established himself as a bold and reform-minded political figure. But it was the Spanish-American War of 1898 that would cement his reputation as a fearless leader and national hero. This brief but consequential conflict provided Roosevelt with the opportunity to embody his lifelong philosophy of the strenuous life in a way that would capture the imagination of the American public. His decision to leave a prestigious government post to serve on the battlefield was a testament to his belief that action and courage define true leadership. At the time, Roosevelt was serving as Assistant Secretary of the Navy under President William McKinley. Though he was technically second in command, his boundless energy and assertiveness made him one of the most influential figures in shaping naval policy. Roosevelt had long advocated for a strong and modernized Navy, inspired by the writings of naval strategist Alfred Thayer Mahan. When tensions between the United States and Spain escalated over Cuba's fight for independence, Roosevelt saw an opportunity to put his ideas into action. He aggressively pushed for naval readiness, ensuring that the fleet was prepared for war when a USS Maine mysteriously exploded in Havana Harbor in February 1898. The explosion of the Maine provided the final spark needed to propel the United States into war with Spain. Though investigations into the cause of the explosion were inconclusive, public outcry, fueled by sensationalist newspapers, demanded military action. Roosevelt, never one to wait idly for events to unfold, took matters into his own hands. While his superior, Secretary of the Navy John D. Long, was away, Roosevelt issued orders mobilizing the Navy, effectively jump-starting the war effort before official directives were given. His proactive approach demonstrated his characteristic decisiveness and willingness to take risks. Despite his important role in preparing the Navy for battle, Roosevelt was not content to remain behind a desk in Washington. He longed to experience the war firsthand, believing that true leadership required personal sacrifice. He resigned from his government position and joined the newly formed 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry, better known as the Rough Riders. This volunteer regiment was composed of a diverse group of men, including cowboys, ranchers, Native Americans, Ivy League athletes, and former lawmen. Roosevelt, who was appointed second in command under Colonel Leonard Wood, quickly became the regiment's most prominent figure. Training for battle was rigorous, and Roosevelt took an active role in preparing his men. He led them through grueling drills, ensuring they were physically conditioned and mentally ready for combat. Despite his aristocratic background, he earned the respect of his troops by sharing in their hardships. He slept in the same conditions, ate the same rations, and personally saw to their needs. His willingness to fight alongside his men, rather than command from a distance, reinforced his reputation as a leader who led by example. The Rough Riders were soon deployed to Cuba, where the war was being fought on land and sea. Roosevelt and his regiment landed on the southern coast and quickly found themselves in the thick of combat. The most famous engagement of the war, the Battle of San Juan Hill, took place on July 1st, 1898. Roosevelt, who had recently been promoted to full colonel, played a crucial role in leading the charge up Kettle Hill, a lesser-known but strategically important position adjacent to San Juan Hill. Mounted on horseback and wielding his pistol, he charged ahead of his men, rallying them to push forward under intense Spanish gunfire. The battle was chaotic and deadly, with American forces facing well-entrenched Spanish troops armed with rapid-firing Mauser rifles. Despite the odds, Roosevelt and the Rough Riders, alongside the Buffalo Soldiers of the 10th Cavalry, pressed on. Roosevelt personally led multiple charges up the hill, demonstrating exceptional bravery. His leadership and the sheer determination of his men resulted in victory, helping to secure a decisive American advantage in the war. The image of Roosevelt, charging up the hill with unrelenting determination, became one of the most iconic moments of his career. The victory at San Juan Hill solidified Roosevelt's status as a national hero. Newspaper accounts of his bravery spread quickly, and his name became synonymous with courage and patriotism. Though many soldiers had fought bravely that day, Roosevelt's charismatic leadership and relentless energy made him the face of the battle. The war itself was short-lived, and within months, Spain had surrendered, leading to the Treaty of Paris and the end of its colonial rule in the Americas and the Pacific. The United States emerged as a new global power, and Roosevelt emerged as one of its most celebrated figures. Following the war, Roosevelt returned to the United States to a hero's welcome. His exploits on the battlefield had captured the imagination of the American public, and his political prospects soared. Though he had already been a prominent reformer in state and national politics, his military service added a new dimension to his public image. He was no longer just an intellectual and a politician. He was now a warrior, a man of action whose leadership extended beyond speeches and legislation. This reputation would prove invaluable as he prepared for the next phase of his career. Fresh from his triumphant return from the Spanish-American War, Theodore Roosevelt was thrust into the political spotlight with renewed vigor. His military exploits had transformed him from a well-regarded reformer into a national hero, and political leaders quickly recognized the potential of his rising popularity. It was not long before the Republican Party saw an opportunity to elevate him further. In 1898, Roosevelt was nominated as the Republican candidate for governor of New York. Though the political elite viewed him as ambitious and unpredictable, his popularity among voters made him an undeniable force in the race. The campaign was energetic and intense, with Roosevelt adopting his characteristic hands-on approach. He traveled extensively across the state, meeting with voters from all walks of life. Whether addressing industrial workers in New York City or farmers in upstate towns, he spoke with conviction about the need for reform, government efficiency, and economic fairness. His ability to connect with ordinary citizens was one of his greatest strengths, and his enthusiastic speeches inspired support from those who had never before been politically engaged. Roosevelt's opponent, Democrat Augustus Van Wyck, was a well-established judge with strong backing from Tammany Hall, the notorious Democratic political machine that had long controlled New York politics. Tammany Hall, infamous for its corruption and patronage system, had little interest in seeing a reformer like Roosevelt in office. The campaign became a battle between Roosevelt's vision of transparent governance and Tammany's entrenched power. Despite fierce opposition, Roosevelt's reputation as a war hero and his relentless campaigning secured his victory. In November 1898, he was elected the 33rd governor of New York. Upon taking office, Roosevelt wasted no time in making his mark. He approached the governorship with the same energy and determination he had displayed throughout his career. His first priority was tackling government corruption, particularly within state institutions that had long been controlled by political bosses. He launched investigations into fraudulent contracts, forced the resignation of corrupt officials, and implemented reforms to ensure transparency in government spending. His actions immediately set him at odds with the Republican political establishment, particularly party boss Thomas C. Platt, who had expected Roosevelt to be more compliant. One of Roosevelt's key initiatives was labor reform. He recognized the growing discontent among workers who faced unsafe conditions, low wages, and long hours. Determined to address these concerns, he pushed for legislation that improved factory safety standards and established fair working conditions. He also championed the rights of workers to organize and collectively bargain, a stance that was considered radical by some within his party. Despite resistance from business interests, Roosevelt remained steadfast in his commitment to balancing the needs of labor and industry. Environmental conservation was another issue that Roosevelt tackled during his tenure as governor. Influenced by his time in the Dakota Territory and his lifelong love of nature, he sought to protect New York's forests and waterways from industrial exploitation. He advocated for laws that regulated logging and protected public lands from excessive development. These efforts were among the first steps in what would later become his national campaign for conservation, reinforcing his belief that government had a responsibility to safeguard natural resources for future generations. Education and public health were also high on Roosevelt's agenda. He worked to expand access to public schools, improve teacher training programs, and ensure that children from poorer backgrounds had opportunities to receive a quality education. Additionally, he promoted policies aimed at improving sanitation and access to clean drinking water, recognizing that public health was essential to a thriving society. His comprehensive approach to governance reflected his belief that government should actively work to improve the lives of its citizens rather than serve as a tool for political elites. Roosevelt's reformist policies, however, did not sit well with the Republican Party's old guard. Party leaders, particularly Thomas Platt, had hoped Roosevelt would be a manageable figurehead rather than a reform-minded executive. Platt and his allies sought ways to curb Roosevelt's influence, fearing that his progressive agenda would disrupt the established power structure. They viewed him as a political liability, despite his popularity among the people. In an effort to sideline him, they devised a plan to promote him out of New York politics by making him vice president of the United States. At first, Roosevelt resisted the idea of becoming vice president. He saw the office as largely ceremonial and feared that it would remove him from the active policymaking he loved. However, intense political pressure and the urging of President William McKinley's advisors eventually persuaded him to accept the nomination. In 1900, he joined McKinley on the Republican ticket as the vice presidential candidate. His participation reinvigorated the campaign, and his presence drew massive crowds, with many attending rallies simply to hear him speak. The McKinley-Roosevelt ticket won the election by a landslide. Theodore Roosevelt's ascension to the presidency was as unexpected as it was transformative. When he accepted the Republican nomination for vice president in 1900, he did so reluctantly, believing that the position held little power and would confine him to political obscurity. However, fate intervened in a way that neither he nor his political opponents could have foreseen. On September 6, 1901, President William McKinley was shot by an anarchist named Leon Czolgosz while attending the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. At first, McKinley appeared to be recovering, and Roosevelt, who had been vacationing in the Adirondack Mountains, assumed that his role would remain unchanged. But within days, McKinley's condition worsened. The wound had become infected, and on September 14th, he succumbed to gangrene. News of his death reached Roosevelt as he was hiking through the mountains. Immediately, he rushed back to Buffalo, where he was sworn in as the 26th President of the United States. At just 42 years old, he became the youngest president in American history. The transition was sudden, and many in the Republican Party, especially those who had sought to sideline him, were apprehensive about what his leadership would bring. Roosevelt understood the gravity of the moment. Upon taking the oath of office, he sought to reassure the nation that there would be continuity in government. He pledged to uphold McKinley's policies, particularly regarding economic stability and international affairs. But those who knew Roosevelt well understood that he would not be content with merely maintaining the status quo. He saw his presidency as an opportunity to enact bold reforms and leave a lasting impact on the nation. One of Roosevelt's first major challenges was dealing with the influence of large corporations and monopolies. The late 19th century had seen the rise of powerful trusts, corporate conglomerates that dominated industries such as oil, steel, and railroads. These trusts often engaged in unfair business practices, stifling competition and exploiting workers. Roosevelt, despite being a Republican, took a firm stand against them, earning him the reputation of a trustbuster. He believed that while businesses played a crucial role in economic growth, they should not be allowed to operate without oversight. Roosevelt's approach to breaking up monopolies was both aggressive and strategic. He invoked the Sherman Antitrust Act, a law that had existed since 1890 but had rarely been enforced. His administration launched lawsuits against major corporations, including the Northern Securities Company, a massive railroad trust controlled by J.P. Morgan. In 1904, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the government, ordering the dissolution of the trust. This victory signaled that Roosevelt was serious about curbing corporate excess, and it set a precedent for future antitrust actions. Beyond trust busting, Roosevelt sought to balance the interests of business, labor, and consumers. In 1902, he intervened in a major coal strike that threatened to cripple the nation's economy. The strike, led by the United Mine Workers, demanded higher wages and shorter workdays. Previous presidents had often sided with business owners in labor disputes, but Roosevelt took a different approach. Instead of simply using federal troops to break the strike, he invited both sides to the White House for negotiations. His mediation led to a compromise, earning him praise as a fair and pragmatic leader. Roosevelt also made significant strides in consumer protection. At the time, there were few regulations on food and medicine production, leading to widespread contamination and fraud. The publication of Upton Sinclair's novel The Jungle in 1906 exposed the horrific conditions in the meatpacking industry, prompting Roosevelt to take action. He pushed for and signed the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act, which established federal regulations to ensure food safety. These laws laid the foundation for the modern Food and Drug Administration, FDA, and demonstrated Roosevelt's commitment to protecting the American public. On the international stage, Roosevelt's presidency was marked by a bold and assertive foreign policy. He believed that the United States had a responsibility to exert its influence on the world stage, particularly in Latin America and the Pacific. His most ambitious project was the construction of the Panama Canal, which he viewed as essential for expanding American trade and military power. When negotiations with Colombia over the canal's construction stalled, Roosevelt supported a revolution that led to the independence of Panama. The new Panamanian government quickly agreed to Roosevelt's terms, and construction of the canal began in 1904. Roosevelt's philosophy of foreign policy was best summarized by his famous phrase, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." He believed in diplomacy, but also in maintaining a strong military presence to back up American interests. This approach was evident in his efforts to modernize the U.S. Navy, which he expanded and strengthened. In 1907, he sent the Great White Fleet, 16 battleships painted white, to sail around the world as a demonstration of American naval power. The voyage was a symbolic gesture that showcased the United States as a rising global force. As Theodore Roosevelt settled into his presidency, it became evident that he was not content with simply maintaining the political status quo. Instead, he emerged as the nation's leading advocate for progressivism, a movement that sought to address the growing inequalities and injustices of the early 20th century. Roosevelt's vision for America was one of fairness, opportunity, and government accountability. He believed that the federal government had both the right and the responsibility to intervene when the interests of the public were threatened by unchecked corporate power, political corruption, or social injustice. One of the defining aspects of Roosevelt's progressive agenda was his belief in the square deal. This policy framework was built on three core principles: control of corporations, consumer protection, and conservation of natural resources. Unlike some of his Republican predecessors, who had favored a laissez-faire approach to the economy, Roosevelt saw the government as an essential mediator between business and labor. He sought to ensure that all Americans, rich and poor, workers and employers, had a fair chance at success without being exploited by monopolies or corrupt institutions. Roosevelt's commitment to progressive reform was particularly evident in his efforts to regulate big business. While he had already established himself as a trustbuster by challenging corporate monopolies, he also recognized that not all large companies were inherently harmful. Rather than dismantling every major corporation, he advocated for federal oversight to distinguish between fair business practices and those that harmed the public. In 1903, he supported the creation of the Department of Commerce and Labor, which included the Bureau of Corporations. This agency was tasked with investigating and reporting on business practices, ensuring transparency and accountability within the corporate world. Labor rights were another crucial aspect of Roosevelt's progressive vision. Though he believed in the importance of capitalism, he also recognized the struggles of American workers. Child labor was rampant, working conditions were often hazardous, and wages remained low for many industries. Roosevelt was one of the first presidents to take a firm stance in favor of workers' rights, advocating for an 8-hour workday and improved safety regulations in factories and mines. His willingness to intervene in labor disputes, such as the 1902 coal strike, signaled a shift in how the federal government handled conflicts between business owners and employees. Beyond economic reform, Roosevelt championed progressive causes in public health and social welfare. During his presidency, he pushed for new sanitation laws, recognizing that poor living conditions in urban areas led to disease and suffering among the working class. He also advocated for stricter regulations on medicine, leading to the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906. This landmark legislation helped to eliminate dangerous and misleading pharmaceutical products from the market and required companies to accurately label their goods. Roosevelt's determination to hold businesses accountable for their impact on public health showcased his belief that government had a duty to protect its citizens. Education reform was another priority during Roosevelt's presidency. He believed that a strong democracy depended on an informed and educated populace. Although education was primarily under state and local jurisdiction, Roosevelt used his influence to promote better funding for public schools and improved teacher training programs. He also emphasized the importance of vocational education, arguing that young people should be equipped with practical skills that would prepare them for the workforce. His advocacy helped lay the groundwork for future educational reforms at both the state and national levels. Perhaps one of Roosevelt's most groundbreaking contributions to progressivism was his dedication to conservation. Unlike many of his predecessors, who had viewed the nation's vast natural resources as limitless, Roosevelt understood the need for sustainable management. He took unprecedented steps to protect America's forests, rivers, and wildlife by expanding the national park system and establishing the United States Forest Service in 1905. During his presidency, he set aside more than 230 million acres of public land for national parks, wildlife refuges, and forest reserves, ensuring that future generations will be able to enjoy and benefit from the country's natural beauty. Roosevelt's progressive policies extended beyond domestic affairs and into issues of racial and social justice, though his record in this area was more complex. He took a controversial step in 1901 when he invited Booker T. Washington, a prominent African-American leader, to dine at the White House. This was the first time a black leader had been hosted at a formal White House dinner, and it sparked outrage among many Southern politicians. Although Roosevelt believed in equal opportunity and condemned racial discrimination in theory, he was often hesitant to push for sweeping civil rights reforms, fearing political backlash from conservative factions within his party. As his presidency progressed, Roosevelt faced increasing opposition from conservative Republicans who resisted his progressive policies. Many within his own party viewed his reforms as too radical, arguing that they threatened traditional economic structures. Roosevelt, however, remained undeterred. He continued to push for stronger government regulations, worker protections, and environmental conservation, solidifying his reputation as a leader who prioritized the well-being of the people over the interests of political elites. As Theodore Roosevelt's second term as president drew to a close in 1908, he faced a difficult decision. He had pledged not to seek a third consecutive term, believing in the tradition of limited executive power. However, stepping away from the presidency was not an easy choice for a man of his boundless energy and political ambition. Determined to ensure that his progressive legacy endured, he handpicked his close friend and Secretary of War, William Howard Taft, as his successor. Roosevelt believed that Taft, a respected jurist and administrator, would carry forward the reforms he had championed. Taft won the election handily against the Democratic candidate, William Jennings Bryan, and Roosevelt left for a lengthy safari in Africa, giving his friend space to govern. However, upon returning to the United States in 1910, Roosevelt found himself deeply disappointed with Taft's presidency. While Taft had continued some progressive policies, he lacked Roosevelt's boldness and charisma. More concerning to Roosevelt was Taft's growing alignment with the conservative wing of the Republican Party, which sought to undo many of the reforms Roosevelt had fought so hard to implement. One of the key points of contention between the two men was Taft's handling of trust busting. While Roosevelt had broken up monopolies selectively, believing that some large corporations were beneficial if they operated fairly, Taft took a more rigid and legalistic approach. His administration pursued antitrust cases aggressively, even targeting U.S. Steel, a company Roosevelt had personally approved during his presidency. Roosevelt saw this as a betrayal, arguing that Taft's indiscriminate trust-busting failed to recognize the difference between good and bad corporations. The final break between Roosevelt and Taft came with the Ballinger-Pinchot affair, a controversy that underscored their conflicting views on conservation. Taft's Secretary of the Interior, Richard Ballinger, was accused of opening public lands in Alaska to private business interests, a move that many progressives saw as a step backward in Roosevelt's conservation efforts. When Gifford Pinchot, Roosevelt's close friend and the head of the U.S. Forest Service, publicly criticized Ballinger, Taft fired him. To Roosevelt, this was an unforgivable act, signaling that Taft was siding with big business over the progressive movement. Roosevelt, never one to stand idly by, re-entered the political arena with full force. In 1912, he declared his candidacy for the Republican presidential nomination, challenging Taft directly. His campaign was built on what he called New Nationalism, a vision that called for stronger federal regulation of business, women's suffrage, social welfare programs, and an expanded role for the federal government in protecting workers' rights. He believed that only a powerful and active government could curb the excesses of capitalism and ensure fairness for all Americans. Despite Roosevelt's immense popularity with the public, the Republican establishment remained loyal to Taft. At the Republican National Convention, party leaders maneuvered to ensure Taft's renomination, using their control over delegate selection to block Roosevelt's path. Outraged and unwilling to accept defeat, Roosevelt and his supporters walked out of the convention and formed their own political party, the Progressive Party, popularly known as the Bull Moose Party. The name stemmed from Roosevelt's declaration that he felt as strong as a bull moose when asked about his readiness to campaign. The 1912 presidential election was one of the most dramatic in American history, featuring a rare four-way race. Roosevelt ran as the Progressive Party candidate, while Taft remained the Republican nominee. The Democratic Party, sensing an opportunity to reclaim the White House after years of Republican dominance, nominated Woodrow Wilson, a reform-minded governor from New Jersey. Meanwhile, socialist candidate Eugene V. Debs also entered the race, drawing support from the growing labor movement. Roosevelt's campaign was unlike any before it. He toured the country, delivering fiery speeches and attacking both Taft and Wilson. His message resonated with progressives, workers, and reformers who believed that the government needed to take a stronger role in regulating business and ensuring social justice. He championed women's suffrage, calling for the right of women to vote, and proposed national health insurance and social security programs decades before they would become reality. His candidacy energized millions, making him the first serious third-party contender in modern American politics. The campaign took a dramatic turn in October 1912 when Roosevelt was shot in the chest by a would-be assassin, John Schrank, while preparing to give a speech in Milwaukee. In a display of characteristic toughness, Roosevelt refused immediate medical attention, instead proceeding to deliver his speech with the bullet still lodged in his body. Holding up his blood-stained speech manuscript, he told the crowd, "It takes more than that to kill a bull moose." The incident only added to his legend, but it was not enough to secure victory. After the bruising defeat in the 1912 election, Theodore Roosevelt retreated from the national spotlight, but his retirement was far from tranquil. Although Woodrow Wilson had secured the presidency, Roosevelt's influence on American politics remained undeniable. He spent much of the next few years in relative seclusion, focusing on personal projects, including his extensive writings and research. Yet, Roosevelt's restless energy and his insatiable thirst for adventure never waned, and his legacy continued to shape the political landscape in subtle and significant ways. In the years following the 1912 election, Roosevelt also became more engaged in global affairs, particularly with the outbreak of World War I. Though he had been out of office for over a decade, Roosevelt's love for the military and his fierce patriotism led him to take a strong stance on the war. He ardently believed that the United States should intervene in the conflict, siding with the Allies against Germany. He criticized Wilson's neutrality policy, arguing that American power and values demanded action. Roosevelt's passionate views on the war resonated with many, though Wilson, his former political opponent, adhered to a policy of isolationism for much of the early years of the conflict. Roosevelt's foreign policy legacy, particularly his actions in Latin America and his construction of the Panama Canal, remained influential. The Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which he had introduced during his presidency, became a cornerstone of U.S. policy in the Western Hemisphere. This policy justified American intervention in Latin American countries to prevent European influence and maintain stability in the region. Though Wilson had a different vision for international diplomacy, Roosevelt's approach continued to shape U.S. foreign relations well into the 20th century. In 1914, Roosevelt embarked on another adventure, one that would allow him to put his love for exploration to the test. He traveled to the Amazon rainforest with his son, Kermit, on an expedition that would prove to be one of the most challenging of his life. The trip was designed to explore an uncharted river in Brazil, but the expedition quickly turned into a grueling test of endurance. The journey was marked by dangerous conditions, including malaria, fever, and the threat of wild animals. Roosevelt, ever the optimist, embraced the hardship, even after contracting a serious illness that left him weak and bedridden for weeks. The ordeal, though physically taxing, gave Roosevelt a sense of fulfillment. It also proved that, even in his later years, he still had the resilience and determination of a man half his age. Back in the United States, Roosevelt's political influence did not fade entirely. In 1916, he considered running for the presidency once more, but the outbreak of World War I made such a campaign untenable. Roosevelt's calls for American involvement in the war, though strong, were not widely supported at the time. By the time the United States entered the war in 1917, Roosevelt had shifted his focus to the aftermath of the conflict, wondering how the world would be reshaped in its wake. Despite Roosevelt's declining health, he was increasingly suffering from heart problems and the toll of his adventurous lifestyle. His intellectual vitality remained intact. He authored several books in these years, many of which were reflections on his life and his views on history, war, and politics. His autobiographies, particularly Theodore Roosevelt, an autobiography, became bestsellers, and his writings helped solidify his place in the public imagination as a larger-than-life figure whose impact on America's future was far-reaching. In January 1919, Roosevelt suffered a heart attack at the age of 60. His health had been failing for some time, but the news of his death still shocked the nation. The man who had once been so vital, who had achieved so much in his short life, was gone. His passing marked the end of an era, but his influence continued to reverberate through the halls of power in Washington and beyond. Roosevelt's legacy, while complicated, was indelible. He had been a president who expanded the power of the executive branch, reshaped American foreign policy, and fought for the rights of workers, women, and the environment. His trust-busting efforts had set the stage for later reforms in labor laws, and his conservation efforts had preserved vast swaths of American wilderness for future generations. His work to improve the lives of ordinary Americans laid the groundwork for the progressive era, even if many of his specific reforms did not come to fruition during his lifetime. Beyond his policy accomplishments, Roosevelt's personality and character defined much of his legacy. He was a man of action, a politician who believed in doing rather than simply theorizing. His energy, his enthusiasm, and his belief in the power of the individual resonated with millions. Roosevelt's life story, rising from a sickly child to become one of the most dynamic figures in American history, embodied the American ideal of self-improvement and the belief that anyone could achieve greatness through grit and determination. While some historians have criticized Roosevelt for his paternalistic views on race and his tendency to overlook civil rights issues, even his critics cannot deny his transformative impact on American politics and society. His presidency marked the end of the Gilded Age and the beginning of the Progressive Era, a time when Americans sought to reconcile the benefits of industrialization with the growing need for social reform. Theodore Roosevelt's legacy is not merely confined to the triumphs and reforms of his presidency, but also to the larger vision he projected for American society. His impact has transcended his time in office, leaving a lasting mark on the country's political, environmental, and cultural landscapes. Long after his death, Roosevelt continued to shape the nation through his values, policies, and the enduring example of his character. One of Roosevelt's greatest legacies was his revitalization of the American presidency. When he assumed office, the presidency was still a relatively weak institution, often dominated by Congress and subject to limited influence. However, Roosevelt's assertive leadership transformed the office into the powerful and dynamic force it is today. He believed that the president was the steward of the people, a position that granted him the authority to act in the public interest, even if it meant challenging the status quo. Roosevelt's expansive view of executive power set precedents for future presidents, especially in matters of domestic policy, foreign relations, and national security. Presidents from Franklin D. Roosevelt to Barack Obama and beyond have invoked Roosevelt's strong leadership as a model for navigating the complex demands of governance. Environmental conservation remains one of Roosevelt's most significant contributions to the nation. His creation of the national park system, the establishment of national forests, and his role in conserving millions of acres of public land ensured that America's natural beauty would be preserved for future generations. His administration's commitment to conservation was not just about setting aside land for recreational use, but about safeguarding the country's natural resources from exploitation and destruction. Roosevelt's pioneering vision of nature preservation was ahead of its time, and it laid the groundwork for the environmental movements that would flourish in the 20th century. Today, his efforts are celebrated annually, with national parks, monuments, and historic sites bearing his name, ensuring that his conservation legacy continues to resonate in the present day. Roosevelt's advocacy for progressive reform also laid the foundation for many of the social safety nets that would eventually be established in the 20th century. Though many of the policies Roosevelt championed were not fully realized during his time in office, his progressive vision for a more just society influenced the course of future American reforms. The expansion of labor rights, the establishment of worker protections, the regulation of business practices, and the promotion of social welfare programs all found roots in Roosevelt's leadership. His work served as a springboard for the New Deal programs of Franklin D. Roosevelt in the 1930s, which transformed American society on a deeper and more lasting level. Roosevelt's calls for a square deal for the common man were echoed in these later reforms. showing that his ideas had a profound and lasting influence. While Roosevelt's progressive policies reshaped domestic politics, his views on foreign policy also left a lasting imprint on America's role on the world stage. Roosevelt's assertion that the United States should exercise an active role in international affairs, particularly in the Western Hemisphere, became a defining feature of 20th century American foreign policy. His interventionist stance in Latin America, symbolized by the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, not only extended the United States' influence, but also set the stage for future American interventions in global conflicts. His vision of American exceptionalism, though criticized for its paternalism, also reflected his belief that the United States had a unique responsibility to lead the world towards stability and peace. However, Roosevelt's foreign policy was not solely defined by intervention. His negotiation of the Treaty of Portsmouth in 1905, which ended the Russo-Japanese War, earned him the Nobel Peace Prize and cemented his legacy as a champion of diplomacy. Roosevelt's belief in peace through strength and his ability to navigate the intricacies of international relations allowed him to influence global affairs in a way few other American leaders could match. His diplomatic efforts served as a blueprint for future U.S. foreign policy, balancing military power with diplomacy and alliances to advance national interests. Beyond his political achievements, Roosevelt's personal life and character have also contributed to his enduring legacy. His relentless drive, resilience, and charisma became emblematic of the American ideal of self-improvement. Roosevelt was a man who overcame personal challenges, from his struggles with asthma as a child to the physical hardships of his later years, through sheer will and determination. His ability to turn adversity into opportunity inspired countless individuals, making him a national symbol of perseverance. He proved that even in the face of weakness and hardship, one could forge a path to greatness through effort and resolve. Roosevelt's larger-than-life personality also made him a figure who captured the imagination of the American public. His love for adventure, his flair for dramatic speech-making, and his unflagging optimism made him an unforgettable character in the nation's history. His popularity endured far beyond his time in office, with a broad public appeal that transcended political affiliations. Even after his presidency, Roosevelt remained an influential voice in the national conversation, continuing to inspire generations of Americans to think more boldly and act more decisively in shaping their futures. Roosevelt's personal sense of duty and service extended beyond the realm of politics, creating a standard of public leadership that future generations would strive to meet. He made it clear that public office was not about personal gain or political maneuvering, but about doing what was right for the nation. His view of the presidency as a responsibility to all citizens, rather than as a position of privilege or entitlement, resonated with those who believed in the democratic ideals of fairness, justice, and equality. In the years since Roosevelt's death, historians and scholars have debated his legacy, with some pointing to his sometimes contradictory views on race, imperialism, and gender. Roosevelt's paternalistic approach to race and his controversial policies toward Native Americans and African Americans have drawn criticism, though it is important to understand them within the context of the time in which he lived. Despite these flaws, Roosevelt's overall impact on American society was overwhelmingly positive, and his vision for a more progressive, fair, and just nation has endured. Theodore Roosevelt remains a figure whose contributions to the nation transcend the boundaries of his presidency. He was a president who reshaped the country's political landscape, an advocate who fought for social justice and environmental protection, and a man who lived a life full of adventure, intellectual curiosity, and tireless service to his country. His legacy is woven into the fabric of the American story, a story of resilience, ambition, and the pursuit of greatness. In this way, Roosevelt's impact will continue to echo throughout history, a testament to a man who, in the words of his own famous adage, dared greatly.